In 2011, Japan was hit by a triple disaster that left the country in shambles. The shock of the event and the mismanagement of the government put thousands of people on the street in protest. Is this a new phenomenon or protest unusual in Japan? Our guest today, William Andrews, says no in his book Dissenting Japan, a history of Japanese radicalism and counterculture from 1945. He argues that Japan, like many countries, has had a history of ongoing political and social unrest since the end of the war. In today's episode, William Andrews will share with the Bento Bureau members, Buzz, Hazel, and Long more about Japanese radicalism.
My name is William Andrews. I'm originally from the United Kingdom, but I came to Japan in 2004, and I spent a few years living in Osaka in the Kansai region. Since then, I've been in Tokyo. I work as a copywriter, editor, and a translator. And I'm also what you might call an independent researcher. So I spend my time observing and researching elements of Japanese social movements and counterculture. Currently, I'm also a grad student as well. My professional work, I do a lot of work in translation, and particularly in the arts industry, so arts and culture, theatre, performance, and visual art as well.
What prompted your change of interest directly to counterculture, may I ask?
Yeah, because from culture to to counterculture and radicalism, that's
Well,
one
you
of
could argue that all culture is a form of counterculture. You could argue that any good piece of theatre should be inherently countercultural, right? And that's maybe a big conversation. But yes, it wasn't a sudden shift. I didn't suddenly wake up one day and think, no, stuff all this mainstream theatre stuff. I want to be, out there with my helmet on and, running around the streets. It wasn't quite simple as that. I've always been interested in the contexts behind culture and art. Even when I was an undergraduate studying literature, most of the things I took an interest in, it was not sort of the pure humanism of looking at literature for its own sake. I was instead interested in how literature and theatre emerges from social cultural contexts. So in that sense, it was kind of a logical shift that I was interested in as well in the general social changes that produced various culture. And I'm not sure exactly when or how it happened, but for example, I was interested in post-war Japanese theatre, and particularly in aspects of the underground, or you might say fringe, but at the time it was known as the underground, the Angular theatre movement, people like Toriyama Shuji, for example, or Karajuro, people like that. So I was reading about that, seeing some things, learning about it a bit, and obviously you can't look at that without understanding what was happening in Japan at the time. It's quite a natural. It goes together naturally with learning about post-war society in general, because all art and culture should be socially engaged, in my personal opinion. And it's not.
I see the point you're trying to make about the reflective nature of art.
Exactly. That's not a controversial thing to say. So I think it's a very very natural thing to do when you're learning about these things. But like I say, it wasn't quite a sudden shift. I can't quite pinpoint exactly. It was sort of happening, you might say, nebulously in my mind for a long time. But certainly, after 3/11, it was very clear that there was a very the time was ripe to think more about it more carefully.
So let's talk about your blog. How did it come about? What the name "Throw Out Your Books" mean? Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Good question. Yes, the blog. It started just simply as an area online for me to put the sort of extra things that I was writing my book, or I was in the middle of writing and researching the book, and I had lots of extra material, and I knew I couldn't include it in the book, so I needed somewhere like a sort of shape it into some sort of article or some sort of format that was suitable for the reader and just publish it, because I thought this was basically the kind of material. It couldn't be, probably there wouldn't be a regular magazine that it's suitable for. It's probably, it's probably kind of too unusual in terms of the content and style. So that's how it started. Since then, it's grown a bit, and I've become more I look now more at, current news as well. The last 2 or 3 years, lots of interesting news articles to cover as well. So it's not simply this sort of extra material. Now it's become a kind of its own life, its own media. The title throughout the books is a reference to Terayama Shuji work. It's both a book, but also a play and also a film. There's three different things. They're all a bit different as well. They're kind of interconnected, but all also different.
Let's talk about your book, Dissenting Japan. What I gathered from your book is that your main argument refers to how people view Japanese social movements as a unique phenomenon, something that's a recent phenomenon. And you argue in the book that Japanese social movements and demonstrations are nothing new and have been around for a long time, and that the myth of Japan as a conformist society is a result of a top-down repression. Am I getting the right kind of message here?
That's a gist of what I'm saying. A lot of that came from a sort of response to the media coverage of the anti-nuclear protests. And interestingly, you saw very similar kind of discourse in 2015, when there was a lot of, again, mass protests against the security bills, and a lot of media coverage about the student group SILDS. And again, we see the same kind of tropes. Oh, Japan doesn't have protests. Japan doesn't have social movements. This is new. Wow, this is very strange for Japan. And it's just simply not true. But yes, there was a decline, that's for sure. And, there are various new elements in these protest movements in recent times. But to sort of paint this very, very simple picture of Japan as being very conservative, very harmonious. People don't protest. It's really not as simple as that. I mean, I'm not saying the opposite either. I'm not saying Japan is, particularly dissentious. I'm not saying Japan is particularly full of dissent and rebellion or protest. That would be, I think, very, very naive and very silly. I was trying my book to set out to, kind of attack this myth, which has been attacked before. I'm not the first person to attempt to attack this myth, and also to try to rearrange and reassess and re-educate people about these quite complex series of movements that happened in the post-war through to I try to bring up to Fukushima. In academic terms, they talk about this as the Nihonron, Nihonjinron, the theory of the Japanese, and it was a very sort of dominant discourse in both English language and also Japanese language scholarship, or some might say para-scholarship. Not all of it was fully academic, especially in sort of the 70s, 80s, during the height of the Japan's bubble, for example. It was a lot about psychology and about business as well. How the Japanese people are doing so well in the economy. What is the way they think? And there must be some, essential reason for this. And a lot of this is driven by, again, similar ideas that we haven't really lost since the war, that the Japanese are this sort of pure race, that they somehow think differently. I think human beings are naturally drawn to stereotypes and to kind of essentializing. I think it's a natural thing. And quite often these stereotypes are based on something real, something tangible. I mean, again, if you walk around in Japan, it does seem quite harmonious in many places. So, it's not the case that it's a crazy idea to think like that. It's true, there is very little street crime in Japan, for example. These are facts. But the problem is when these become grand theories, and they're used to explain, an entire nation of people, of over 100 million people. It's simply too simplistic. So I was trying to readdress this balance and to say no. These protests we saw in the wake of Fukushima are not completely out of the blue. There's a lineage that we can trace back. And in some ways, we can actually trace very, very recently to interesting ones, only a few years before Fukushima. But I think I was the first person to try and put together a coherent summary of the various social movements and counterculture movements basically from the end of the war through to Fukushima.
Would you say that the starting point of modern radicalism in the country would be the post-war period?
Yeah, this is difficult. I decided to start with the post-war just because that was what I was interested in. And it seemed like a very, very logical way to start. And you can definitely see that things do start there. There is a start point. Many things happened, obviously, after the war. Unions were made legal again. The Communist Party was made legal again. People were able to vote and so on. So it was, there was a kind of rebirth of civil rights, which led to, obviously, a lot of social movements. So it's a very logical start. But I'm also aware that if you start your narrative in the post-war period, it looks like Japanese radicalism or Japanese social movements only really started because of Western influence. Japan lost the war. They adopted a constitution that was, obviously written by the Americans, and then all these foreign ideas like Marxism and so on swept through the country. There's radicalism and counterculture in Japan that goes way back, much further. So it's not a foreign import at all. There's a very strong history of peasant rebellions in Japan, and again, there's actually quite a lot of scholarship and literature about that. So the historical side of Japanese rebellion is quite well documented and quite well discussed, actually. You mentioned that top down earlier. So again, these sort of things like the Meiji Restoration was very top down, and likewise 1945 was very top down. So a lot of these major shifts in the country's history have been very, very top down. So whereas a so-called revolution or a so-called big social change has been imposed by people in power who replace other people in power. Again, that's not unique to Japan either. I mean, most countries don't have successful grassroots rebellions.
We have been talking a bit about radicalism and counterculture. So before we start talking about the events that happened after the war, let's start by defining the terms radicalism and counterculture in the context of Japan.
I chose the word radicalism because I think it's has less negative connotations. Words like extremist or far left or far right, these have negative connotations. So I like the word radical because, although some people might have negative connotations, generally speaking, it's more neutral. Yeah, the book is not about social movements in general. It's not about a civil society in general. Again, I touch on those issues, but there will be a very, very big, it's a much, much bigger canvas. So I focus just on the radical ones. So people who are trying to implement a very, very big change in society. Again, I don't use the word extreme, but some sort of very, very revolutionary change in society. That could, of course, be something like Marxist or socialist, for example. But it's not only that. So people who are involved in counterculture, they are in some form or another rebelling or moving against countering the mainstream culture. And that, of course, could be violent. It doesn't have to be violent, though. Some examples and movements I look at are not violent in a way, but they are proposing some kind of very, very different system, a very different value or lifestyle system. Most famously, they are the people with helmets on and throwing Molotov cocktails. But it's not only that. I also, for example, talk about the Orm cult towards the end of the book. And again, so I thought that it's a form of counterculture. Also, one of the reasons because those kind of new religions have connections with aspects of the student movement. So that it was a logical kind of narrative jump. But for me, that's also a form of counterculture. And likewise, I talk about various experimental arts movements in Japan in the group, because the book is not just about avant-garde art. Again, that's a huge topic, but instead I try to find ways that these radical art movements or radical cultural movements were also proposing, big social changes through art, not purely just experimenting with new forms of art in their own right, but somehow socially engaged.
And do you see any similarity or connection between Japanese cultural movement with the Western cultural movement in 1960s?
That's a great question, and one day I would like to write an article just about that, because it's something I only really touch on a little bit in the book. But the whole idea of the transnational, international parallels or connections between the different movements is a huge topic. And there have been a lot of books about, late 60s or early 1970s counterculture or protest movements in America, particularly also Europe. There's a growing body of literature about this, and there's now quite a strong understanding that it was a kind of global movement. And Japan is part of that, that's for sure. But again, the problem is each country is quite different. What was happening in France is very different from what happened in the UK. What was happening differently in Germany, Italy, and of course also the United States. So it's difficult to make kind of complete, perfect comparisons. But what's interesting is that the students at the time were also drawn towards these comparisons. They compared what they were doing themselves to what was happening in Paris. They try to make contact with other groups overseas, mostly not very successfully because obviously it's before internet, right? So everything was very, very slow. But people came to visit. Many prominent foreign cultural figures, for example, famous people came to visit and speak to various Japanese social movements here. So there was definitely an element of exchange going on. That being said, there are certainly very specific aspects to the Japanese social movements. Visually, there was a strong difference. The use of helmets and the use of stick staves and so on. These are quite different. I mean, there's a little bit of controversy about who started wearing the helmets first. Was it happening in America first, happening in Japan first? Again, I've read some sources which claim that they were inspired by Japan. I've never really found the truth of that. I don't think maybe it will ever be known. But definitely the Japanese radical left groups, for example, they have elements which are very different to the ones in the West. And I think that becomes increasingly the case as the time goes on. Although you can probably find some quite easy comparisons in the 60s, I think by the 70s it looks very different in Japan. It's become a very, very internal movement. Isn't so internationally focused anymore. And then obviously the right, the far right in Japan is very, very different. It's very, very specific. And of course there's ultra-nationalism in every country. But the ultranational in Japan is very, very culturally specific. So this is the kind of tension I was also finding in my book. The more I wrote and the more I explored, I was trying to fight against this essentialist myths, the idea, Japan is like this because it's Japan, this sort of idea of a uniqueness. So I was constantly sort of trying to almost pull those myths down. But sometimes I was finding myself almost reinforcing those myths. Sometimes I was finding things which were very culturally specific, and I couldn't find a universal or international equivalent.
The 1960s certainly is a era of turbulence. We have the left, and after the reverse course, we have a lot of movement. We have the 1960 movement against the Kishi's government. I think that was one of the biggest one in history.
Yes.
So perhaps you can give us some stories about that era.
Okay, well, maybe I'll just highlight a couple of examples. When Japan regained its sovereignty from the United States, there was a strong movement against the United States military bases in Japan. And that was led by locals, but also by the student league called Zengakuden. And there's quite a lot of different base movements. The one at Tachikawa in West Tokyo was probably the most famous. One of the reasons for this peak in base movements was obviously because there was an immediate reaction to this situation, because they've been given their sovereignty back, but actually many people didn't really realize the extent of how many bases there were going to be. And so people were really shocked by that, I think. And also because of the Cold War was happening. So people were quite, the implications for these military bases in Japan are, it's quite serious. Also, there are many more bases than there are now. So there are a lot more bases then, and many of them were close to big areas like Tokyo. So it's very easy for people to see them and to go and protest them. Today, most of the bases are in Okinawa, right, or in areas far away from Tokyo. So it's in some ways easy for a lot of the population to forget about it. But that wasn't the case in the 50s, for example. You can see a lineage then as they move towards the renewal of the security treaty. You can also see how these base movements, these anti-base movements, then grew towards the end of the 50s and when there was the timing of the renewal of the security treaty between Japan and America. And so by this point, it became clear to many people in the population what the implications of the security treaty were. And again, the Cold War was becoming more and more serious. So the positioning of Japan as part of the American side it's quite serious, because Japan is very close to, obviously, China and also the Soviet Union. When there was the renewal of AMPOL, the security treaty, it was a galvanizing force, and the protests against it were made worse from the government's point of view by Kishi, the prime minister's handling of the situation. So the way that the government tried to kind of railroad the renewal of the treaty through Parliament only made things worse in terms of increasing the number of people who were against it. I think what's really important about AMPOL, obviously there was a lot of people on the streets. The numbers are very, very impressive, historically speaking. But secondly, it's more about the movement's incredibly wide, incredibly broad across society. You had obviously students, and obviously there were unions. Sohyo existed then. Sohyo was this big umbrella organization of multiple unions. It doesn't exist anymore. And so, if your union says we're going to protest this, suddenly you automatically have 1 million people who are going to go on strike. Right? This idea of organized labor was very, very effective at organizing the numbers. But it also, everyone from taxi drivers to housewives to lots of famous people. It wasn't just simply left-wing students or unions. It was this very, very broad sweep of society that were involved in this movement. I think generally that's what's seen as being the most important thing about the 1960 AMPOL movement is the sheer scale of the civil society involvement in it, which hasn't really been replicated since.
So you mentioned demonstrations, riots, strikes, some student organizations and campuses. What about assassinations or international terrorism?
Okay. Assassinations. Well,
I think there was a case when a students
Stab a politician on stage.
yes,
staff.
Asanuma. He was a socialist politician. So most of the assassinations in Japan have basically involved the far right. People from Japan's ultra-nationalist movements basically killing people, politicians, but also people who are not politicians, also killing themselves, suicide as well. So it's basically doing stunts to draw attention to what they are angry about. The important thing with the far right to remember is that there are lots of groups. They're not really united. It's not a big movement in that sense. They're all kind of individual groups. So if you go to Yasukuni on August 15th, you really see that. There's lots of different trucks, but they all belong to different groups, and they're not really sort of working together. I mean, you could say they are part of a general movement, but it's not the case that the right wing, the far right, were going to take over Japan at any time. Although there are people in the establishment, politicians who are sympathetic to them, it's not the case that they were really posed a big danger to society. So again, these violent acts, they are shocking when a politician is killed or stabbed or injured or a house is burnt down, as happens sometimes. These are shocking events, but again, they are almost the exception that prove the rule. They are strange events. They break the norm. In terms of international terrorism, that's a bit more complicated. So that jumps us forward to the 1970s, really. The Yorugo in March 1970 by members of the Sekigunha, the Red Army faction. So several members of this group, slightly strangely armed with a mixture of real weapons and fake weapons, in a slightly amateurish fashion, managed to hijack an airliner, Japan's first ever passenger airline hijacking. At a time, Japan did not have a law against hijacking, actually, because it was seen as though no one really knew about it. And they were trying to get to Cuba. Eventually, that was the eventual goal, but instead they got stuck in North Korea. It then becomes quite controversial with what happened to them in North Korea. Did they stay there? Or were they involved in various kidnappings of Japanese people in Europe, for example? But that's probably the most famous the most famous example of Japanese international terrorism at the time. Then you have, for example, groups like the Japanese Red Army, which is linked to the Yorugo hijacking, but not actually directly. The Japanese Red Army grew out of a group of Japanese people who went to Palestine, or basically Lebanon, but the Palestinian areas, to work with Palestinian groups like the PFLP, who at this time, in the early 70s, incredibly successful in their hijackings and in their international, what we call now terrorism. For them, of course, they wouldn't use that word. So they started off basically as volunteers assisting them. and then eventually they formed their own group called the Japanese Red Army. It sort of grew out of the Red Army faction, domestic group, but it's not exclusively Red Army faction people. There are also many other people from different movements. The Japanese Red Army became a sort of vessel that collected all kinds of interesting people together in the Middle East, and they were active around the world, actually, trying to collaborate and partner with all kinds of different groups that are generally regarded as terrorist groups, but that's a very subjective word. We should be careful of how we use that word. But South America, Europe, Middle East, Africa. So there's a fascinating transnational movement there that basically lasted for a long time. Although the numbers of people involved were quite small, they were there for a long time, and many of them are still there. Many of them are still in the Middle East somewhere or somewhere else, and they're still wanted. You pass Japanese police stations, you'll see their name, you see their faces and their names on the little wanted posters. The most famous ones have been arrested and have come home. That's for sure. Obviously, Shigenobu Fusako, for example, was arrested about 27 years ago in Japan, and she's still in prison now. It's important to remember that the most notorious things they did, the things that people, by and large, were done for very practical reasons. For example, one of their members or one of their associates was arrested and held in prison in Japan or somewhere else. They wanted them to be released, so they would, for example, they would seize an embassy or they would seize a plane and force the government to release those people. And they did that was successful. So because it was successful, they were able to repeat that act more than once. But according to them, they weren't trying to kill people. They weren't trying to kill innocent people. If an innocent person was killed on a mission, for them that would have been a failure. They wanted to try and achieve their practical goal, but at the same time, they didn't want necessarily to innocent people to be hostages, for example, to lose their lives. And this is controversial, especially when you consider what happened in 1972, which was the Lod airport attack. There are different interpretations of what happened, so we'd be a little bit careful what we say. Essentially, 3 Japanese people flew into the airport, and they had guns with them. There was a gunfight. Gunfire was exchanged, a lot of gunfire, and a lot of people were killed. And most of the people who were killed were not even Israelis. They weren't even Jews. They were actually Christians. So there's a lot of people in the airport, in the waiting area. So basically people got caught in the crossfire. Or if you believe other interpretations, which the general media stories, that they were indiscriminately firing at these innocent people. So again, there's different stories. The fact of the matter is many people died. That's definitely a fact. And two of the Japanese people also died. And again, whether they killed themselves, kamikaze style, or whether they were killed by the Israeli forces, again, it is not categorically known. One survived, and he was held in prison in Israel for a long time. So this incident is often seen as a Japanese Red Army incident. But again, you have to remember that at the time, but what we now think of as the Japanese Red Army, a group with a strong agenda, did not exist at that time, and they were still either doing their own thing or they were attached to elements of the PFLP. Later, the Japanese Red Army sort of claimed that attack or that mission, into that operation, as part of their history. That's why it becomes very complicated. But in actual reality, at that time, it wasn't the case that Japanese people were in charge of what happened in that operation. Depending on different people, there's a different interpretation every time.
Well, that really made me go wow, because I've never heard of terrorist acts being committed by Japanese national outside of Japan.
Yeah, I would say the Lod Airport is pretty famous. But maybe it would have been more famous at the time. And certainly during the 1970s, when the Japanese Red Army was really active, everyone knew of the group as the group that did that terrible thing in Israel. So at the time, it really amplified their notoriety with the police and with the media.
How would you say the nature of Japanese radicalism has affected media culture in the country, or vice versa?
Very good question. It's a very big question. It's like a PhD thesis there. A very simple answer is that, by and large, the media either, particularly now, generally ignores counterculture, or they don't treat it fairly. Generally speaking, for example, every time the police want to search or raid one of these far-left groups' facilities. They would tell the media in advance. So the media will all be there, lined up their cameras, ready to film the police coming in. And sometimes if the door is locked, the police will have to bring a sort of a metal cutter. So it all looks very dramatic and sensational. Here the police are very carefully using the media, and the media is also letting themselves be used to help perpetuate an idea that these groups are dangerous, antisocial. Maybe they are. That's not for me to say. But it's important to note that the media representation of them is very biased. There are some, alternative media, and also the tabloids, the weekly magazines in Japan. They're not necessarily quite like that. And you do, occasionally see some very interesting articles and very fair articles where they try to speak to activists. One quite famous instance involved a tabloid reporter basically kind of colluding with a radical group. Again, so he was sort of covering the activists and he was interviewing them. It got to the point where he knew things that were not public. And the police realized this. And they realized that he was basically withholding evidence about the crime. And so the journalist got arrested, actually. This was actually made into a book and a film called My Back Page. On the other side, thinking about the ultranationalists, the right, the mainstream media is very often a target of the ultranationalists. Most famously, the Asahi newspaper, or the Asahi group. This year was the 30th anniversary, actually, of a murder in the Hanshin bureau of the Asahi Shimbun, where shots were fired and a journalist was killed. The perpetrator has never been caught, actually. Again, so when the media is covering elements like the far right, again, they have to be careful because if they write something, they may become targets of violence themselves.
It seems that in the past 20, 30 years, there have been a decrease of the number and also the scale of these social movements. If I'm not mistaken, the 1995 sarin gas attack could be one of the last violent events. How would you explain this transition of Japanese movement, social movement, and protest?
Generally, there is an understanding or a narrative that the Japanese student movement, particularly on the left, declined from about the mid-70s onwards. I take some issue with that narrative because I don't think it's so simple that social movements and student movements disappear completely. You can find lots of involvements with social movements from young people and student movements throughout the 70s and 80s as well. But it is a fact that there was a general decline. Numbers did go down. And there are a number of reasons for that. Things like the 1972 United Red Army, the Rengo Sekigun incident. There was a siege at a house, a villa in Karuizawa, and a woman was held hostage by several radicals, and after it came to light that the group had been involved in a purge, an internal purge that winter, where several members, their own members, had been killed in horrible ways in the mountains. This was very shocking because people had been seen as being heroes, defying the police, holding out for several days in this villa, were suddenly now villains. So it was a massive media sensation and a big shock to the left in Japan. This was then compounded by an increase in the number of internal conflicts between different groups. So the far left groups began to fight each other. And this got worse and worse throughout the 70s. Something like 100 people or so have been murdered through this civil war between different groups. And there's several involved. This is known as uchigaba in Japanese, this sort of internal give out or violence. And that actually continued. I mean, there was still violence, there were still people being killed and still people being attacked through to the 2000s, actually. So it's not actually disappeared completely. But obviously, when there was at a peak in the 70s, that was a terrible image for the public. So if you were students and you saw on campus one of these groups, obviously you would be scared by them because now you associate them not with fighting the state and fighting the system, you associate them with fighting other left-wing groups. That obviously contributed to the decline in the student movement. There are other also structural reasons as well, the way that a new law was passed that made it easier to control what was happening on university campuses. And generally speaking, private universities, particularly in Japan, have put a lot of effort into, cleansing the campus or cleaning the campus of these groups now. If you're at a private university, it's almost impossible now to be a member of one of these political groups because they are not allowed to be on campus. But in the past, they had an office at the university. They were certain social clubs or circles were connected to the group. that guaranteed them a certain number of recruits. That's not the case anymore. So the whole system has been dismantled. So that definitely contributed to the decline in student movements. There are still violent incidents, though. I mean, but again, just because it's violence doesn't mean there's no social movement or there is social movement. I try to kind of disconnect them a little bit. But the violence and extremism are special cases, I would say. There's still one far-left group in Japan that is committed to, you might describe as violent attacks against US military facilities. I mean, they're more like stunts than actual violent attacks. They basically make a homemade rocket launcher, and they would sort of launch a kind of projectile at the base or towards the base. You know, it almost never causes any damage at all. And they usually do it at nighttime as well, so no one's hurt. So it's basically a stunt, right? But you know, it's still essentially a violent act and a quite serious crime because it involves explosives.
You mentioned how the violence has been toning down, the banning of having official presence of such radical groups in campus organizations. Do you think that's paved the way of sorts to more artistic ways of expressing demonstrations and social movements, such as with the group SEALs?
Especially if we look at the recent demonstration against the War Bill Article 9 or Post 311 nuclear weapons, the students, they are finding a new ways to send a message to the public, such as through art, rap, make it cool, make videos.
Yes, absolutely. Obviously, the number of people involved now is much lower, but those who are involved, their motivations are different, and their tactics are definitely very different. SEALs is a fantastic example. People like me or other observers were really interested in the group because it's very, very clear the way that they were presenting themselves and how different to other groups. They were very clearly trying to present themselves as very futsu, as very normal, regular college kids who just happen to be engaged in this very, very important political issue. So if you look at their publicity and the way they present themselves to the public, they were very, very smart and savvy, and they looked fashionable. They didn't look dangerous. They didn't look violent at all. They looked attractive. They were good-looking kids wearing nice clothes. That's very different to what happened in the past. I don't think necessarily they were looking at past images and saying, let's do something different to that. It wasn't quite as simple as that, but it's a natural process. For their generation, they probably know nothing about many of the post-war movements. One of the campaigns SEALs did reference the 1960 AMPOL, for example. They were trying to kind of look back to that past, but generally speaking, their knowledge and understanding of the post-war movements is probably quite low. And that's probably a good thing for them because they don't have that baggage. But because they're born afterwards, you can also see it earlier as well. You know, looking back at the 80s and 90s and in general the Heisei period in Japan, the large unions have been broken apart, and the number of irregular workers, hakken workers, dispatch workers, is much higher now. The structures that organize social movements has completely changed. So it's much more grassroots and individual led. So you've seen a lot more ad hoc groups. The growth also of frita protests, or frita groups. You know, frita are these sort of part-time workers or irregular workers, people who aren't necessarily in a mainstream full-time corporate employment. And the way they have engaged with protest has been much more playful, much more fun and vibrant. And that stuff has been ongoing for, arguably almost 3 decades. So what we're seeing now with SEALs, but also the 311 movements and the use of music, the use of rap, and the use of sound trucks, and to basically turn the protest march into a kind of carnival or parade, is, I would argue, a evolution of what's been happening since the start of Japanese neoliberalism and a response to that. So although the numbers of people in one group might be quite small, you see a much bigger variety of groups popping up.
With the new mechanisms and new ways of demonstrating in Japan, what is your perception on the continuity or changes in social movement in Japan? Should we expect large-scale and influential movements or otherwise?
The current government is committed to doing some quite radical things, such as revising the constitution. These are very, very emotional or emotive policies that will definitely get a strong response, both in Parliament, in the Diet, from other politicians, but also on the streets. That's guaranteed. I think the question is how the government does it. If they go at it, go at full throttle in a very aggressive way, it will get a very strong response. But the government might choose to do those kind of constitutional revisions piecemeal, one piece at a time, a small bill here, a small change here, and that will mean it's. I don't think you'll see the strong mass movement. With the security bills, for example, 2015, it was a very clear. There was a set of bills, a set of different revisions. It became a rallying point because people could really attach one issue to this much bigger issue. So we are protesting these bills, which which will bring Japan into war. So we're anti-war, so we protest the bills. It's very sort of straightforward. But for example, other things they've been doing haven't created the same large response because they haven't been quite so clear. So if you can somehow hide what you're doing a little bit in sort of complex legislation, you won't get such a strong response, that's for sure. So I think that's a big factor. The opposition is also very disunited. This year we had with election, all kinds of crazy things happen with the opposition parties. So I think that's also a big factor. If the opposition continues to disintegrate, it also means you won't see, that means you don't get organization that can mobilize people. And that's very important, I think, because although we now live in an age of social media was a big thing, for example, post 3/11 in organizing people and bringing new kinds of people to the streets. That only goes so far. You still also have to have strong overall organizations and bodies which can galvanize people and provide leadership and an alternative vision. Looking ahead, for example, we have things like the 2020 Olympics as well, and there are some protest movements involved there who are voicing dissent in opposition to the Olympics. But again, this hasn't really attracted a strong media response at all. So people just don't really know about these movements. So I think that's also important that although the internet and the web allows basically all kinds of movements to put their information out there, if people don't even know about it in the first place, they won't find it. So there is an issue of information there, or not reaching the right people and dissemination. So I would say that we will continue to see a great variety of movements, but unless there is a single strong event or action by the government, you won't see a mass movement again.
It has been a fascinating talk. For the listeners who are interested in your work, how can they find out more?
They could, for example, visit my blog, throwoutyourbooks.wordpress.com, or they could read my book, Dissenting Japan. Obviously, many things have been happening since my book first came out, so I need to sort of update it, but my blog is probably the best place for recent developments in terms of Japanese radicalism and social movements.
There's so much to talk about and so little time. Thank you very much, William Andrews, for joining our discussion today.
Thank you for having me.
That's all for our episode on the history of Japanese radicalism, counterculture, and social movements with William Andrews. We hope you learned something new from listening, as we sure did. As always, if you're interested to learn more about Japanese society from an international perspective, Bento Bureau is always hard at work producing new content. If you like this, please consider supporting by liking our social media pages, such as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are always looking to improve, so your feedback is highly appreciated. Leave us a review on iTunes. Thanks again.